Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. And as I've been saying, if you're enjoying what you're hearing and you haven't subscribed, hit that subscribe button, whether you're listening to us on one of the many podcast platforms you can find the Lunch Hour on, or if you're watching us on YouTube. And if you are watching us on YouTube, no, you can always listen to us on platforms wherever fine podcasts are found. And if you're listening, you can always check out the show on video on YouTube. And please leave a review. Let your friends know. Let your family members know. Let your friends, family members know, et cetera, et cetera. Joining me right now, and as I've now used the word twice off camera, I'm now going to use it a third time. I'm going to be so gauche as to read his bio. His name is Mike Frederickson. He is the CEO of Systems Innovation Engineering. He's been involved in systems engineering for the last 30 years, specifically aimed at improving DoD system affordability and industrial-based supplier resiliency. Mike has been involved in strategically developing and enabling collaborative initiatives by aligning R&D investments with logistics and acquisition. He's got a long-time affiliation with the United States military and the Department of the Defense. Mike was the director of the Office of Naval Research Electronics Manufacturing Technology Center from 1996 to 2017. Mike, that's not the one that's up in New Jersey, is it? Along the New Jersey Turnpike? No?
Yes. Where we're at right now is we're actually located at Rowan University, so we're not too far off of.
Okay, but you know what I'm talking about? When you drive on the New Jersey Turnpike, you see what looks like the tower of an aircraft carrier off.
That's actually up in Moorestown. That's Lockheed Martin. So yes,
got it. Okay, so there you go.
Yes.
Well, let me keep going through your bio. You were responsible for developing and executing technology programs that directly improve the affordability of Navy platforms and sensor systems. He graduated with honors from CSU San Bernardino with a Bachelor of Science in Physics, so he's a legit scientist. He has been involved in the development and deployment of advanced process controls for the electronics industry and holds numerous patents that have been successfully transitioned to the electronics industry in the fields of process control tech and electrochemistry. He retired from the Air Force in August of 2001 with his last position as commander of the 122nd Logistics Support Flight based out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. As I said, a storied career. We are so glad to have him on the show today. Mike, let's start here. And I'm going to go here. I mean, there is a real science to logistics that I would think your physics background would lend itself well to. Talk about that. Talk about the science of logistics and how that relates to the natural forces of the world.
So the science of logistics certainly spent the better part of my time in uniform in the logistics area, where I was supporting both in a combat communications type scenario and also a aircraft F-16 squadron and deployed during the Iraqi freedom activity. I can tell you the science of logistics is at the end, I always used to, when you talk about solving a problem, or you talk about a solution, or you talk about the science of something, I always like to start off with what your end state is, right? What are you trying to achieve?
Yes.
Right. So when you talk about what the end state is, it's being able to supply a warfighter at the time they need the part, when they need the part, in order to accomplish their mission, right? And so many storied, different than what I do today in uniform, many storied ways of trying to get parts to folks in harm's way. And that is, but the rule of thumb there is always make sure, and it does roll back to supply chain. It rolls back to always assuring that you have the ability to acquire the parts you need, and then the ability to deliver those parts to where they need to be. And there's one other component to that too, is assuring that we design in reliability. So we need less parts to begin with, right? So there, when you look at logistics, reliability is your friend. Because if things don't break, you don't need to supply them. So that's
sure. Well, and it comes back to, reading Richard Marcinko, who was the founder of SEAL Team 6. Mm-hmm. In his book, Rogue Warrior, he talks about the concept of KISS. Mm-hmm. Keep it simple, stupid.
Yep.
As my brothers My brothers are fond of saying, if it's stupid, then it's smart. I mean, there's ways to do this. We'll circle back to that, but let's talk about supply chains. So we've talked to a number of people who are involved in this issue.
Right.
It's something I find particularly fascinating, right? I'm always fascinated with markets generally. And I view markets as organic structures in and of themselves, if they're governed organically or they're approached organically. Mm-hmm. Supply chains, we're at a moment, we're at it's funny because you have critics of sort of free market capitalism mm-hmm. who complain about the fact that, well, we'll have peaches that are grown in South America or pears that are grown in South America, and then they're shipped over to Asia to be packed, and then they're sent over to the United States, as though there's something wrong with that. I mean, obviously, you could talk about the carbon cost or whatever, but that's one way of viewing it. Mm-hmm. But on the other end, there's something very miraculous in that kind of a system. Mm-hmm. But we understood that there were weaknesses that were exposed on this through COVID. Talk about what COVID exposed in sort of our approach to supply chain management.
So my experience is mostly defense, and I will say that I believe that what the pandemic did is the supply chain that it issues that it exposed was, in many cases in the Defense Department, we are very used to saying, well, our systems are more complex, they're more difficult. Therefore, the fact that I only have one supplier, or the fact that I have a single supplier, or the fact that I designed a system or a subsystem that only one company can produce, we kind of lived with that for a while. And in fact, when the last administration came in 13806, the executive order was written. They listed all these archetypes, and they said, sole source, single source, all of these were significant risks. But yet we, in some ways, said, well, but our systems are complex. They're difficult, very hard to find another source, and it's very expensive. And in fact, those are things that I've heard. When the pandemic came along, I think when we found out that the root, or let's call it the supply chain at the very base component level, things that we were getting from foreign sources, things that we were getting from even domestic sources that mispredicted, right? They thought that the supply chain was going to go down, right? So they ratcheted down. The whole reason we have the problem, right, is they ratcheted down their production. The reverse occurred, and they got caught, right? And so it was business decisions that ended up creating most of those types of problems. But at the end of the day, I think what really became paramount in the defense side was that it really taught us that we need to do a better job. We need to do a better job. It's much like you were talking about logistics, right? What's the end state? The end state is to never get caught without a supplier, to never get caught without having some level of protection, in some level of a second source, or some level of designing in a product that may be more of a commodity. So let's get back. Let's. My mentors used to teach me that facts and fallacies, right? They look a lot alike, but the reality is that a fallacy looks like a fact. The fact is that defense systems are complex, but they can be designed with resiliency. So
is part of the problem here, right? When we're talking about systems that are designed for defense, or objects, as you said, commodities that are used by the Defense Department. The Defense Department, the DoD it's not, I'm going to flip the sole source. They are the sole beneficiary. So if something is not going to be used in the general civilian marketplace, then it becomes harder to have something beyond that sole source provider, especially for some kind of a unique environment. I mean, talk about that. I mean, there's no... Right. The example I like to use, when I talk about healthcare, for instance, and about healthcare competition in marketplaces, I like to say, well, when Costco needs more toilet paper, they go to their supplier of toilet paper, or they have a number of different suppliers of toilet paper. We can't do that with medical care, because we can't just go to med schools and say, hey, we need 100 more doctors this year, so give us 100 more doctors. That's not the way it works. It seems to me the same kind of a vulnerability happens with folks who supply material for the Defense Department. What do you make of that?
So There's different grades, right? So when you say
Yep.
material, you can start at materials, then you start at components, and then you start at next level assemblies, right? So it depends on what.
Yeah, I'm trying to use a generic term here, Mike.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay.
So yes.
So let's go up that scale, right? So the materials, for the most part, yes, the Defense Department has exotic materials. So
Yeah.
from that perspective, I think I think you must secure your supply chain, right? You're probably, maybe there's a single source, maybe there's a possibility you could bring in another source. I think as you get into components in the electronic side, we, for the most part, buy commercial components, right? So we're pretty much already there. I think as you start rolling up into subsystems,
Sure.
I believe now that there is an opportunity. I believe there's an opportunity to look at least two different sources that can provide you that subsystem and designing in a system. And I think, one of the things that we've learned over the past 5 or 6 years and some of the mission that we've been asked by the DoD to work in is to design in supply chain resiliency, to design it in, right? So if you design in a subsystem that multiple companies can produce, then you once again can build that in. If you don't think about that, if that's not embedded in your system design process, then I concur with your position that you will succumb to that. Yes.
So when we come to these issues of systems, and it's interesting again, because you sit at a very unique intersection, given that you've gotten a number of patents yourself. So when we're talking about systems and subsystem design, and listen, maybe this is my naivete or my ignorance in all of this, I'm thinking about the intellectual property issues.
Mm-hmm.
And right, so when we're talking about drugs, there is this period of exclusivity for the developers. I guess part of what I'm talking about is the issue of the balance between innovation and the need for resiliency and the need to sort of broaden the marketplace. So somebody invents a new system, a new way of doing things. They go and they market it to the DoD. The DoD wants to buy it, but in the name of resiliency, they need to get multiple sources. What's the push-pull here?
Yeah.
And am I overstating it by wondering if there's a danger of discouragement of innovation? I know it's a complex question, but you can give me a complex answer.
So let's back up. Let's approach it from a slightly different angle, right? We want innovation. We want small businesses. We want companies that continuously provide us innovative solutions, and we want to protect their IP. I mean, that is our country's founding, innovation and our ability to stay ahead of our adversaries is through innovation, is through technology. But I'm going to reverse your argument. If we do a good job, and I contend, and this is actually one of the recommendations we made in some of the CHIPS Act money, was if the DoD creates a clear demand for what they're looking for. So in other words, you go out to the innovators and you make it clear what you're looking for, they will innovate. And I don't think we do necessarily a really good job of that today.
Okay.
But if you create a clear demand, now, I'm reversing your argument, now that innovator, that person with that technology is going to come back and provide you a solution that is what you're looking for.
Got it.
And so now you can have 2 or 3 people with different technologies providing you that innovation, and now you have competition.
Okay, so then, and this is why I love these discussions, to then take that a step further, because you have career civilians at DoD sort of driving policy in certain ways. Obviously, you've got military officials who are making decisions that are free from politics. But on the other hand, you have this political dimension out of both Congress and the executive branch, where there are demands being put. Sometimes these decisions take years. How does the role that politics and the shifting politics and political demands, how does that play into the DoD being able to give out clear instructions on how to innovate? Is this not a problem? And I'm just sort of spitballing.
So when I look at, I always like to think when we're designing a system, when we're looking at a threat to national security, and we're trying to design in ways to defeat that. I guess I'd love to live in a world that says that that's not political.
Sure.
But let's step back and look at a political dimension of maybe priorities, right? Maybe one political dimension is more industrial focused. Maybe they're putting billions of dollars into, supply chain and workforce readiness. And maybe another political position might be to enhance and to grow major ACAT 1 and ACAT 2 programs to drive more systems. Both need to be done, right? And both are things that are good for this country. I contend that both need to be in check. I think overfunding an industrial base and not directing that towards real needs and checking to assure that we are achieving the objectives we're looking for would be not money well spent. And I think to run large ACAT 1 programs, again, unchecked, I think additionally, or that, I think it's a balance. And I think I would like to say the work that we're doing today in both the last administration and this administration, I think the work is the same. We're trying to deliver affordable weapon systems. And that's...
Well, and it comes down to it, right? It's one of these things, and this is where I think some of my friends in the free market community just don't understand. When you're talking about, we all know anytime you're talking about government, there's going to be some kind of inefficiency in there. It's just the nature of the beast. And obviously we could talk about we've been talking about the political dimension of this, but just because there is, and I'm going to use the word waste, and I don't mean it in a negative way. How did you just use supply overages, surplus, right? We've always had, issues of surplus, but just because you're creating surplus doesn't mean that it's wasteful, I guess is my point here.
Agreed.
And right, and we don't, that's just the nature of the beast, is we are keeping a nation prepared to defend itself. You're going to have things again. Well, right. I mean, I'm sorry, I know I'm sort of getting far afield here, but if we didn't have surpluses, if we didn't have these kinds of redundancies, or we weren't striving towards this, then we wouldn't have older weapon systems that we could give to or sell to, say, Ukraine, if Ukraine is attacked by its neighbor in Russia. I mean, am I wrong here about sort of this characterization of supply of surplus and how that actually can be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I got to admit that's surplus, and how much surplus you maintain is probably not one of the areas that I've spent a lot of time in. But certainly, I think one of the challenges that we're currently having right now, given what's happening in Ukraine from a supply chain perspective, is we now need to start up production.
Yes.
Right. And there was a wonderful comment that I saw from the Deputy Secretary of Defense yesterday. It was wonderful when she was talking about autonomy and talking about how we drive to the next let's say, innovative thought process toward defeating our adversary that might outpace us from the perspective of numbers. And then at the end, she says, but we must figure out how to produce, right? Which comes back to the supply chain and our domestic capability to produce. And that's really what it rolls back to. And I think those are the challenges when you talk about surplus. Those are the examples that are hard problems we're trying to solve right now. We need to build more missiles. We need to build more. Yes. We've used a few, right? So, and the funding is there. Congress has appropriated the funding, which is good. I think we've got the priorities right. The real question, back to the Deputy Secretary, right? We got to produce, right? It comes back to our domestic supply chain. How do we expand our domestic supply chain? How do we achieve something far beyond what we have today?
Let's get really simple, because I want to talk about things like the CHIPS Act, but let's get really simple here on that question, right? Because one of the things there is, and I want you to comment on this, there's an inherent danger in having the U.S. outsource so much of some of the basic elements of this production, whether it be electronics gear or whether it be ammunition or other things, outside of the United States. It's a conversation I've had with folks about the Jones Act, which is a separate but somewhat related issue in this area. But the reality is, when our labor costs and our regulatory costs are higher, not that you may, and if you don't want to comment on that, you don't have to, but how do those kinds of things impact our ability to gain domestic production or start domestic production? And is there anything that can be done about it in the name of improving the supply chain system?
So there's a couple of components to your question. I think
Yeah.
the one which is how do we compete globally
Right.
when we have a situation where our labor rates are higher and we obviously have more regulatory types of activities than other countries may. I contend technology, innovation, automation. I contend that you can stay competitive. There are plenty of examples. One that I'm very familiar with, which is the area of RF microelectronics.
Okay.
Go look at capability down in Texas. Look at capability in North Carolina and in Oregon. They're competing globally.
Right.
And we are manufacturing these products here. And so I contend that with the enhancements of what's happening in Arizona, with fabs opening up there, more fabs opening up in Texas, I contend with automation, innovation, we can be competitive globally.
And is there anything that those states, you may not know this offhand, but and you should never ask a question you don't know the answer to. But is there any way? This is part of what I do here is I ask questions that I don't know because I'm genuinely curious. Is there anything that those states are doing to encourage such facilities in their midst? Is there something that the federal government is doing to encourage that those states do what they need to do?
I honestly, I would not have the knowledge. I do believe that obviously Arizona's been a little aggressive. I would contend,
Sure,
more than likely. I think the nature of the climate is helpful in those areas, and I do think that is one area that just bringing the attention of microelectronics and the CHIPS Act, bringing the attention level that we must bring these fab capabilities back on shore, and mitigating our risk associated with things that may be being produced in areas that are in jeopardy or potential jeopardy in the future. Then I think, yes, I think all those things combined cause that. But yes.
Well, it's a perfect segue. Talk about the CHIPS Act and what that does and how that deals with supply mitigation issues. Talk about that.
So, I mean, our association with the CHIPS Act has been more or less on the defense side. I think we've been in a capacity to be able to make recommendations in our current in the current role that we've had. I contend, there's two components of the CHIPS Act. There's a component that's the Department of Commerce, and then there's a component that is the Department of Defense, which is a much smaller area, actually executed under, I think, a program called ME, microelectronic.
Okay.
But I think, at least my perspective is, as long as there's accountability, as long as you can, again, I'm back to the end state. If you're going to go spend money, know what your end state is, right? And measure yourself against that. And I contend that there's the resources that are being provided, the expertise that I've been connected to, I think over the past year, domestically within the US that I never knew existed, bringing people together to go try to solve this problem, I think is amazing. If the CHIPS Act did nothing more than bring forward the capability that our country has at world-class universities, companies working together collaboratively to go solve this problem, I contend the CHIPS Act alone, outside of the money, I think the money caused that to come together, but I contend that coming together to go solve this problem is huge. But back to the end state, if we don't have more fab capability here and we still have dependencies in places like China, then I would say that we were not necessarily that successful. And I will also say on the defense side that we clearly, back to the demand, if we clearly do not communicate to all these resources that we brought forward now with the CHIPS Act, all these world-class universities, if we do not do a good job creating a demand back to these experts, these organizations that have world-class capability, I contend that is going to be the biggest challenge, is communicating the demand and the need that we have from the DoD to assure that we get that transition, that we get all of this capability and mitigate our dependencies on foreign sources.
So let's talk about the nitty gritty, right? The CHIPS Act passes, it goes over to Commerce and elsewhere to get implemented. How does this get implemented? I mean, is it just, dealing with the procurement process, or are there other areas in which this sort of this gets transmitted? This is, of course, great interest to me in the policy work that I do. How does this get translated onto the regulatory side of things, or the agency actions and guidance and things like that? What has to happen there?
So, I mean, I have a limited understanding from the perspective that I'm involved in, mostly from the defense side. I do know that the Department of Commerce has reached out to a few program executive offices that we support, that they are, they're providing some avenue to have direct support from Commerce to program executive offices. I would say my most familiarity is with the DoD side, which is where that was exercised underneath other transaction, where they went out and my understanding is they had over 1,000 project submissions of ideas and thoughts.
Wow.
It was significant. It was large. There were 6 different commodity areas, RF, they called it electronic warfare. It was edge processing. There was a whole variety of different sectors that they divided it into. And actually, I thought, as far as bringing teams together, bringing the best of what America has together to go work within the defense side, I actually thought the work done by the folks running that did a good job. I mean, they really got the word out. So,
but this applies in so many other areas, doesn't it? It's funny because I bring up coming back to commerce, right? You think of Homeland Security and you think of emergency preparedness. Mm-hmm. And you think of, I just learned that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has their own sort of Navy and their own uniform corps, I should say. It's not really, I would never want to denigrate the Navy in that way or denigrate no one that way. But, they have their own uniform corps that mans ships. And so, obviously you have other agencies that are engaged in a similar kind of effort, as I said, Homeland Security, preparedness, et cetera, that engage in these procurements, but other agencies as well, they would benefit from sort of reforms that focus on supply chain. Mm-hmm. As I said, I know you focus on DoD, but how can this apply sort of to the general government these kinds of reforms? So
let's step back and talk to what I believe the work that we've done to date, and then I'll explain kind of that transition. So we were asked by an organization within industrial policy called the Industrial Base Analysis and Sustainment Program to go look at emerging weapon systems, directed energy weapon systems, RF sensors, radars. We were early on years ago, and we very quickly, as we started looking at vulnerabilities, domestic vulnerabilities, this is pre-pandemic, right? And we were looking at these, and what we began to realize was that it's not a simple spreadsheet. It's not something you simply go in and look at, here's our tier 1s, tier 2s, tier 3s. You start to break that down, it gets a little bit more complex. And it gets more complex in one way, is what I'll call capability and capacity. So to one weapon system or to one, let's call it company, and let's say to a tier 1. That tier 1 could be a medical provider, device provider. It could be a tier 1 defense supplier. When they look at their supplier, and when you start to look at suppliers, that supplier is go back to basics, right? They're supplying a capability on schedule and on budget. That's what they're doing. They're providing you a capability. So let's step back for a minute and look at our supply chain. When we are actually managing our supply chain, are we quantifying and maintaining that capability that we're acquiring? Do we even know what capability we're acquiring? Right. And so what we learned very early on was that one tier 1 over here with this tier 2 supplier, they would say, this is a domestic resource. We can't lose this resource. The other tier 1 would look at that resource saying they providing almost very similar things cannot meet our requirement. Right. And so what you begin to realize is that your supply chain is very dependent upon the demand you're putting on it.
Got it.
So when you start to talk about supply chain issues, right, we can sit there and talk about, is there a tie back to China? Have they declared bankruptcy? Let's go look at the financial side of the company. Let's go. Right. But if you just step back saying, can that company continue to keep providing me the capability I'm looking for? We don't track that.
Sure.
We don't do a good job tracking
wow.
that, right? We don't. And
Wow.
so this is what we did within industrial policies. We started to say we need to start tracking domestic capability and capacity. And now we're directly supporting a major program executive office in this exact venture with this exact same thought process, because tracking your domestic capability really provides you, oh, well, now that I know exactly what I'm getting from this supplier, allows me to go get maybe another supplier.
Sure.
Okay. But
yeah.
So second sourcing. Now also when I'm designing a system, right? And this is kind of an important part, is today, if an electrical engineer designed in a component that didn't work, probably wouldn't stay in their job very long. Okay.
Right.
Okay. But as systems engineers, we'll design a subsystem with a specification that nobody can produce. We'll do that all day long. I mean, we'll do that all day long, and then we'll go out and we'll try to negotiate, and we can't find any sources, right? So it's an interesting. It's a simple thing to say. It's a hard thing to do, but what we need to be doing, and this works for defense, this works for medical, this works for any, is designing in your resilient supply chain, knowing what exists out there domestically. And understanding as you start to specify what you want your vendor to do, understanding that there's a marketplace for that. And that is the exact problem that some of our, let's call it emerging weapon systems, have run into, is when we look at what we want them to do and we start to decompose that demand onto the supply chain, we realize there's only one source or there are no sources that can go do that.
Right.
And now we have a supply chain problem, right?
It's interesting because I think about, oh, good Lord, the name of the gentleman is now escaping me. The first gentleman, he declared himself a professor, who went and sold the United States Army, the Union Army, on balloon technology, and worked for months to try to get the War Department interested in that. And finally, he had to go, and I know his name is not Professor Armistead, but he eventually had to go and do a demonstration. He got his balloons loaded on the boats that were going down to the Peninsula campaign during the Civil War. You finally pestered somebody enough at the White House and the War Department and said, put your balloons on. We'll go and see how they worked, and they were used. In fact, as the story goes, a young second lieutenant, George Armstrong Custer, was one of the first soldiers to engage in aerial reconnaissance that way. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, just in terms of sort of the idea of going and selling weapon systems, that nobody else, an emerging weapon system. Right. Not that we would call that. Would you call a reconnaissance platform a weapon system?
Yeah, it's a sensor, right? So when you think about a weapon system, right? A weapon system can either sense something, track something, kill something, and that's kind of what we think about. That's the kill chain, right? So when we talk about weapon systems, they have a variety of different things that they do. But yes,
all right. So but how we for whatever reason in America, we do business with people that we don't like very much, and sometimes have competing foreign policy interests or in fact military interests or what have you. This is always the push-pull in terms of trade. Mm-hmm. Setting aside even the ones that we do, how are our adversaries working to erode our supply chain, or are they working to erode our supply chain?
They are. Yeah. In fact, when we were first brought on board, in the first year, we found that, and I kind of want to, it's, I kind of mentioned before, capability matters, right? It really does, right? When you think about a supply chain, capability matters. I also want to say that another lesson that we learned is the little things matter. It's the little things. And so when you look at a couple of things, and I'll mention that, is when we brought on board, we were starting to study high-energy lasers, and we started to review this. And what we found in the first year is that one of our adversarial countries, China, actually had come in and procured the majority and left one company each in a $2,000-$3,000 component, and they basically completely undermined our entire supply chain in that. But it was a component, and
Wow.
it's the little things that matter, right? Now, there's not a laser that is produced today for industrial purposes or other purposes, right, that don't need these parts. And so immediately you become dependent on foreign sources then, because you have one source left, right? So, but because it's $1,000 part, and because everybody's like, it's just a commodity part, it's $1,000 part, right? People go, it doesn't matter. I mean, we have hypersonic problems. We have these problems. We have these problems, right? And so our adversaries are very good at getting at a lower level and basically eroding the underpinning. And, it's you're going to get to the point where you're not going to be able to buy $1,000 part, but that's going to upend a $10 million system.
I got a weird question here with that. I mean, is that the responsibility for monitoring that? And I know we've been sort of talking about it in various ways, but is the responsibility for monitoring things like that, is that a DoD issue? Is that a defense intelligence issue? Is it something that the various alphabet soup agencies ought to be monitoring? Who should be monitoring our supply chains to make sure that Nation X is not buying up companies that produce the very small components that we need to make these things?
So
whose responsibility
I think it's gotten a lot better.
Yeah.
We work out of an organization. I mean, there's an organization very close to where we report into, and it's called CFIUS. And so they've done a good job. From that point, obviously, immediately the last two, we have been working with them very closely, and with the information we have. That is a really good question. I think in the position we're in, it's interesting that as a couple of things are important in order to do that, right? You kind of have to have market knowledge. So if you look at how we track company capabilities today, sector by sector, how we actually do that today is we have really smart people in those sectors, right? Subject matter experts in the RF microelectronics sector, or in the optics and EOIR sectors, or in the composite sectors. So we have experts that exist in those arenas, and because they have that in what I'll call inherent market knowledge. So I don't necessarily have the right answer to say who should be doing that. I know who tracks it, and when we see it, and I know when others see it, there is a process to file that with CFIUS to prevent that from.
And just so my listeners and viewers are understanding, CFIUS, is that an acronym?
Yeah, that's you're going to hit me with what CFIUS stands for.
I'm sorry,
but it's
don't worry about it. But it is an acronym, CFIUS or something.
Yes, CFIUS. Basically,
IUS.
They are the folks that whenever a foreign entity is procuring, and I believe any procurement, even an alignment of companies, I believe they have say in whether it can occur.
Okay.
And so.
Wow.
So when we see things like that, where we have these domestic sources, we do report, others do, I know. And when we've held a couple of supply chain workshops, they've showed up to our meetings. So they're very active. They're very proactive. So I would say that in the last 5 or 6 years, they've become extremely proactive. So there are people doing it. Yes. So.
And rightly so. So, Mike, before I let you go, it happens. You become Secretary of Defense. You're Secretary of Defense for a day. You have a magic wand. You wave your magic wand. What are you waving your magic wand towards? What would you do on that one day?
So I actually believe that what we're focusing on now, from a strategy and a direction, is the right answer. I mean, from what I'm reading, the leadership. I've said this: the past 5 or 6 years has been the best leadership I've ever seen in the Defense Department. All the way, it's amazing. So I think the focus is right. I think the one shift that I would make is, it's the little things that matter. It is clearly understanding our domestic supply chain. Not just understanding, big data and what we can grab.
Sure.
Clearly understanding our domestic capability and capacity, and finding innovative ways of doing that. I think is equally important. Once you now have that, you then begin to understand where your dependencies are at a very rudimentary level. We still procure materials from China. We still do. As much as you can pass as many laws and acts and executive orders as you want. The system is in place, right? It is when you buy commercial product, right, which we do in the Defense Department, there gets to be a point where there is no other source that you're just stuck, right? And so I think by really understanding the domestic capability, our suppliers' true capability, inside the Defense Department and outside, to your other point, we used a company that recently on an effort that made radio transmitters for 100 years in Ohio. That's what they've done.
Wow.
And they now proved out that they could actually be on a naval vessel, right? And so we took the best of what America has, right? And that to me is what's really important. If we're going to solve this problem, we got to take the best of what America has.
What I love about this, Mike, is that you are concerned, right? And rightfully concerned. Your concerns are based upon facts and knowledge. But what you're talking about is optimistic in a way that we need great optimism for the future. How do folks find out more about the good work that you're up to, Mike Frederickson?
We have a website. That's one way. Certainly, a lot of the stuff that we're working on with the Defense Department is not on the website, but sure. But we're more than happy to have conversation, and that's the best way to get a hold of us.
There we go. Well, listen, and obviously we'll have links up, and when we tweet this out, et cetera, et cetera. My guest has been Mike Frederickson. He is the CEO of Systems Innovation Engineering. So glad he could join us today. This is the end of yet another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I've been your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.